The first deer appeared on a Tuesday morning in early November of 1878, when the frost still clung to the pine boards of Louisa Maddox's porch like a secret, and she nearly tripped over the carcass in the gray half-light of dawn while reaching for the firewood she had stacked against the wall. She stood there for a long moment in her wool stockings and her late husband's oversized coat, staring down at the animal. It was a young doe, dressed already, the hide pulled back neat and clean, the meat wrapped in burlap that had been tied with a length of leather cord. Whoever had left it had not done so carelessly. The work was careful, deliberate, the kind of work that spoke of a man who had been doing this particular task for a very long time. Louisa looked up and down the narrow mountain road that wound past her property, the pines standing dark and silent on either side, and she saw nothing. No tracks in the frost, no figure disappearing into the tree line, just the deer and the cold and the pale sky beginning to lighten over the eastern ridge. She brought the meat inside. She had no choice. She had $400 to her name and a half-empty root cellar, and a winter ahead of her that the older ranchers in Calhoun's Creek were already calling the worst they had seen in a decade. The mountains above the valley were already wearing their white caps, and it was only the first week of November. She had come out to this small log house at the edge of the Colorado Territory, to this piece of land that her husband Thomas had filed for and died on before he could work it into anything worthwhile, and she had told herself she would last the winter on her own. She was 26 years old, she was stubborn as a fence post, and she was not going to ride back to Ohio with her hat in her hand. But the deer changed things in a way she could not entirely explain. She butchered the rest of it herself, something Thomas had taught her on one of their better afternoons, and she salted the cuts and hung them in the cold storage room off the back of the house, and she thought about who might have left it and why. The nearest neighbor was Earl Pickett, a lean and suspicious man of 50 who ran cattle on the flat land to the south, and had already made his opinion plain that a woman alone had no business trying to hold a homestead. He was not the type to leave gifts without announcing them loudly and expecting something in return. There was Pastor Holly's in town, 12 miles down the mountain road, and his wife Clara, who had brought Louisa a pie when Thomas died in September. But neither of them would have come all this way at such an early hour without stopping to knock. She asked around the next time she rode down to Calhoun's Creek for supplies. The town was small enough that secrets were hard to keep, but large enough that there were men she did not know by name, men who drifted through or came down from the high country only occasionally. Cal Morrison at the general store shrugged and said he reckoned it could have been any number of mountain men who ran trap lines up in the high timber, men who came through the valley and wintered in the hills. He mentioned one name in passing, almost reluctantly, the way men mentioned things they considered none of a woman's business. Warren Garrison, Cal said, runs a trap line from up near Soldier's Peak all the way down through the hollow. Comes through maybe once a month, trades furs for supplies. Keeps to himself mostly. Does not cause trouble, does not say much either. That is about all I can tell you, Cal added, sliding her flour across the counter. Louisa filed the name away and rode home through the gray afternoon, the wind coming off the high peaks with a bite that made her horse pin his ears flat. The second deer appeared 7 days later. This time she was up before dawn and she heard something on the porch, a soft, heavy sound, and she went to the window and peered through the frost-edged glass. The figure she saw was just becoming visible in the first gray suggestion of light. He was large, broader through the shoulders than most men she had known, dressed in heavy furs and a dark wool coat, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He moved with a slowness that was not clumsiness but something more like deliberate quiet, the way a man moved when he did not want to startle an animal. He set the deer down with care, straightened, and then stood for just a moment looking at the house, and Louisa held her breath without quite knowing why. Then he turned and walked back toward the tree line, and within seconds the pines had swallowed him whole as though he had never been there at all. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the empty road for a long time. His name was Warren Garrison. She was nearly certain. She did not know why she was nearly certain. She only knew that whatever she had seen in that brief, strange, pre-dawn moment, the care with which he had set the deer down, the way he had stood looking at the house, not with the proprietary air of a man who expected gratitude, but with something quieter and more difficult to name, it had moved something in her chest that had been still for a very long time. She went out and brought in the deer and did not tell anyone. The third week he came, she was ready for him. She had been sitting up near the window with her kerosene lamp turned low, telling herself she was reading, knowing she was not reading. She heard him at midnight, later than the previous times, and she watched him come through the gate with the deer over his shoulders like it weighed nothing at all. She could see him better this time because there was a half moon, and she could see that he was younger than she had initially imagined. Somewhere in his 30s, perhaps, with a dark beard and a careful way of moving that seemed at odds with his size. He was not a graceful man in the ballroom sense, but he was graceful in the way that the landscape was graceful, big and quiet, and entirely at ease in itself. She watched him leave the deer and she watched him turn to go, and she pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and thought about opening the door and calling out to him. She did not. She let him go. But she thought about it for a long time afterward while she lay awake in the dark and listened to the wind come screaming down off the mountain. By the fourth week, the snow had come in earnest. It had come all at once, the way storms did in the Colorado high country, dropping 2 feet in a single night and then another foot the next morning, and then a silence so complete it'd wait to it. Louisa spent 3 days digging out the water trough and the small stable where she kept her horse, and the 2 goats she kept for milk, and she burned through more firewood than she had planned, and she lay awake at night running numbers in her head and coming up short no matter which way she added them. The root cellar was holding. The salted venison from the first 3 deer was holding. But there was a point in February, in the deepest dark of winter, that she could see from here like a wall, and she was not sure she had enough to get to the other side of it. She rode down to Calhoun's Creek when the road cleared enough to risk it, the horse picking his way carefully through the packed snow, and she went to see Clara Holly's, partly for the company, and partly because Clara was the kind of woman who knew things and was willing to say them. They sat in Clara's kitchen with coffee and Clara's thin but warm ginger cake, and Louisa told her about the deer without planning to. She had not meant to tell anyone. But Clara listened with her hands wrapped around her mug and her sharp, dark eyes steady, and when Louisa finished, Clara said quietly, "I know Warren Garrison. Not well, but I know of him." "Tell me," Louisa said. Clara paused in the way she always did before she said something she wanted to say precisely. His mother was a Ute woman, Clara said. His father was a trapper out of New Mexico territory. Warren was raised mostly in the high country, did not have much schooling, does not come to town often. People here are not always kind to him on account of his blood. He has a cabin up on the south slope of Soldier's Peak. Mostly he is alone. Always has been, far as I can tell. There was a silence between them that held more than either of them said out loud. Louisa rode home through the white afternoon thinking about a man who had grown up in the high country, raised between 2 worlds and claimed fully by neither, who now moved through the darkness before dawn leaving deer on the porch of a widow he had never spoken to. She could not figure the logic of it except that perhaps there was no logic. Perhaps some things simply were what they were. On Sunday, she sat down at Thomas's old writing desk and took out a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote a note. She wrote it and scratched it out 3 times before she got it right. What she finally wrote was this: "Mr. Garrison, I believe these gifts are from you. I am grateful beyond what words will carry. The winter would be harder without your kindness. I do not know why you have done this for a stranger, but I would very much like to know. If you are willing, there is a hot meal and a warm fire inside whenever you choose to come in from the cold. You are always welcome here. Yours respectfully, Louisa Maddox." She folded the note and walked out onto the porch in the cold and tied it to the burlap wrapping of the 5th deer, which had arrived that morning while she was still asleep, and then she went back inside and told herself she had no idea what would happen next and that she was fine with that. She was not entirely fine with that. She went to bed that night and thought about the note until she could recite it back to herself word for word, and she still was not sure she had said what she meant. 6 days passed and nothing happened. The deer arrived on its regular schedule, a Tuesday morning again, and there was no response tied to the burlap. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she had expected nothing. She was not convincing herself. On the 7th day, she was in the stable, breaking ice off the water trough for the second time that morning because the cold had come back harder than ever, when she heard the gate creak at the front of the property. She straightened and listened. Footsteps in the snow, heavy and deliberate, coming up to the porch. A pause. A knock, not loud but firm. 3 even knocks. Her heart did something she had not expected it to do. It did something she had almost forgotten hearts could do. She set down the ice pick and walked through the stable and around the side of the house, her breath coming out in clouds, and she came around the corner and there he was. He was standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, and she could see him clearly for the first time in full daylight. He was tall, built like a man who had spent his life in the mountains, broad through the chest and shoulders but not ungainly, with dark hair and a dark beard that needed trimming and eyes that were a warm, serious brown that looked at her with a directness she found she did not mind at all. He looked at her like he was seeing something real rather than something he had already decided about. He said, "Miss Maddox." His voice was lower than she had expected, and careful, the way his movements were careful. She said, "It is Mrs. Maddox, though I suppose these days just Louisa will do well enough." He absorbed that without expression. He said, "I got your note. I guessed as much," she said. A silence. The wind moved through the pine tops above the property and sent a little shower of snow down from the roof. He said, "I did not mean to cause trouble." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Mr. Garrison, you left me 6 deer over 6 weeks in the worst start to winter I have seen since I came out here. That is not trouble. That is the reason I am going to make it to spring." Something in his face shifted just slightly, but she caught it. It was not pride exactly. It was something more careful than pride. She said, "Will you come inside?" He looked at the door for a moment the way a man looks at something he wants very much but does not entirely trust. Then he nodded once and put his hat back on and followed her inside. The house was warm. She had a good fire going, and the place smelled of wood smoke and the rabbit stew she had started that morning. He stood just inside the door until she gestured to the chair near the fire, and then he sat in it with the careful deliberateness of a man who was not used to sitting in chairs, or at least not in chairs that belonged to other people. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of him and sat across from him and thought, "This is the strangest thing I have done since I came to this territory." He said, "Your husband was Thomas Maddox." It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "He died in September, fever. He was sick before we came out here, but we did not know it yet, or maybe we knew and did not say it out loud." Warren Garrison looked into his coffee cup. He said, "He filed on this land the spring before last." "I know," she said. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" He looked up. His expression was not quite apologetic and not quite comfortable. "I camp on the south slope in hunting season. Your land backs up to the timber I run through. I have been past this house a number of times." She said, "And you decided to leave me, dear, because—" He was quiet for a beat. "Because you were alone," he said, "and because winter is long." It was such a plain statement that it almost undid her completely. She took a breath and said, "Well, thank you, I mean that." He nodded. She said, "The stew will be ready inside the hour if you are willing to stay." He looked at the door again. She got the distinct impression he was calculating the risk of something she could not entirely see. He said, "I am willing." So they ate together. She served the stew in the 2 blue pottery bowls she had brought from Ohio, which now seemed like objects from another lifetime, and they sat at the small table and ate, and she asked him careful questions, and he answered them in careful ways and slowly, gradually, Something in the room loosened, the way a rope loosens when the tension on it eases. He had grown up on his father's trap line and learned the mountains before he learned much else. His father had died when Warren was 17, his mother some years before that, and he had been on his own in the high country ever since, which meant he was perhaps 33 or 34 now. He was not precisely certain which. He said the last part without particular sorrow, just as a fact, and she thought about what it meant to be a man who had been alone so long he had lost track of his own years. She told him about Ohio, about her father's dry goods store, and the way Thomas had come in one afternoon with a look in his eye that could only be described as westward. She told him Thomas had been a good man with a good heart and a dream that was bigger than his body could support in the end. She said this last part quietly, and Warren Garrison listened with his whole attention in a way that she found remarkable, because most men she knew listened only until they could start talking again. He left before dark, pulling on his coat and his hat with the same deliberate care with which he did everything. At the door he paused and said, "The trap line runs this way again in 2 weeks. I could bring the venison by again then." She looked at him. She said, "You could bring it by sooner than that if you wanted." He looked at her. There was a stillness in him that she was beginning to understand was not coldness but was something more like depth, like a still pool over deep water. He said, "I will think on that." She said, "You do that." After he was gone, she stood in the middle of her warm kitchen and looked at the 2 empty bowls on the table and thought that Thomas, wherever he was, would probably have found this entire situation highly satisfactory. He came back in 4 days. Not 2 weeks, not 1 week. 4 days on a Saturday afternoon with a cut of elk this time instead of deer, and a small bundle of dried herbs she recognized as something her grandmother had called mountain sage. He did not explain the herbs. He set them on the porch railing and knocked, and she opened the door and they looked at each other for a moment, and then she stepped back and he came inside. That afternoon was different. The first visit had been careful, like 2 animals circling each other to assess whether there was threat. This time there was less circling. She was mending a tear in her coat when he arrived and he sat in the chair by the fire, and she sat across from him with her mending, and they talked more freely. Or at least she talked more freely, and he said more than he had the first time, which amounted to the same thing. He told her about the mountain, about the places he knew in the high timber where the elk wintered, and the beaver dammed the creeks, and the aspens in October turned a color that he said he did not have a good word for. She said, "Gold." And he said, "More than gold." Like gold if it were alive. She looked up from her mending and found him looking at her, and they both looked away at the same moment. He came back the following week, and then the week after that. There was always something, a quarter of deer, a haunch of elk, a brace of rabbits, once a sack of dried beans he said he had more of than he needed. She always had coffee on. She always had something warm to eat. He always sat in the same chair by the fire, and she always sat across from him, and gradually the distance between the visits shortened. One afternoon in December, he arrived to find her on the roof, which had developed a dangerous buildup of ice along the north edge, and before she could say anything sensible, he had climbed up beside her and was breaking the ice free, with the methodical efficiency of a man who had dealt with such things many times before. They worked in silence mostly, the cold clean and sharp around them, and when they climbed back down and stood in the snow catching their breath, she looked at his hands and said, "You are bleeding," without thinking, and reached for his wrist without thinking. There was a cut along the back of his right hand where the ice had caught him. She held his wrist and looked at the cut, and when she looked up he was looking at her face with an expression she could not parse, and she let go of his wrist and said, "Come inside. I have cloth for that," and he followed her without a word. She bandaged his hand at the kitchen table. She had done it for Thomas many times and she knew how to do it efficiently and well, but this was not the same as doing it for Thomas. Her hands were steady, but something behind her sternum was not. He said quietly, "You do not have to tend to me." She tied off the bandage and said, "You have been tending to me all winter, Mr. Garrison. I think I can wrap a hand." He was looking at her with that deep, still look. He said, "You could call me Warren." She looked up at him. She said, "Warren." He said nothing. But something in his face opened up a fraction, like a door left ajar that had always been shut. She said, "Then I am Louisa. Just Louisa." He said, "I know." By the deep middle of December, she had begun to look for him in a way that was no longer casual. She found herself going to the window in the afternoons when the light was right and standing there longer than was strictly necessary. She found herself saving things to tell him, observations about the elk she had seen on the ridge above her property, a strange quality of light on the snow one morning that had made everything look briefly golden, things she had not had anyone to tell for months. She found herself setting 2 cups out when she started the coffee without examining the impulse. She was not naive about what this was. She was a widow of 3 months and a practical woman who did not indulge in fantasy. But she was also a woman who had been alone in a way that went past loneliness into something more fundamental, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that Warren Garrison had begun to fill a space that she had thought would stay empty. What she did not know was what he felt. He was a man of considerable reserve. He was kind to her, consistently and quietly kind, in ways that cost him time and effort and supplies he did not have in excess. He listened when she talked. He noticed things. When the woodpile was getting low, he restocked it without being asked. When one of the goats seemed off, he looked it over with a practiced eye and said it needed more grain. He was, she thought, one of the most considerate men she had ever known, but he did not say much that was personal, and she did not want to push on a door he had not chosen to open. It was Earl Pickett who clarified things for her, in the thoroughly unpleasant way that Earl Pickett clarified everything. She was in Cal Morrison's store on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of December, getting salt and a few things she needed, when Pickett came in stomping his boots and looking like a man with something on his mind. He gave her a nod that was not particularly friendly and then said, loud enough for Cal and the 2 other men in the store to hear, "I hear you have been taking charity from that half-breed trapper up the mountain." The store went very quiet. Louisa set down the can of salt she was holding. She turned and looked at Pickett with the full weight of a gaze that Thomas had once said could stop a clock. She said, "I have been receiving gifts from a generous and capable man who has probably kept me alive through November and December, yes. If that is what you mean." Pickett's jaw set. He said, "People will talk." "People talk about everything," Louisa said. "People talked when I stayed on after Thomas died. People talked when I fixed my own roof. I expect people will keep talking no matter what I do, Mr. Pickett, so I have decided to stop planning my life around what they might say." Pickett looked at her and then looked at Cal and then said, "It is not decent," and walked out. Cal watched him go and said, "Do not mind him, Mrs. Maddox." "I do not," she said, but her heart was hammering. She rode home through the cold afternoon thinking about what Pickett had said, not because it wounded her, but because it clarified something. Because she had heard the ugliness in his voice when he said half-breed, and she knew that Warren Garrison had been hearing that kind of voice his whole life. She knew what it meant to be a man caught between 2 worlds in a time and place that demanded you pick one and be grateful you were allowed to. She knew that his aloneness was not only a matter of temperament. She thought about that for a long time, and it made her feel something fierce and protective that she had not expected. He came on the Thursday before Christmas. The snow was coming down when he arrived, soft and thick, the kind of snow that made the world small and quiet. She had known he was coming, or hoped it, and she had made proper bread for the first time since October, coaxing the sourdough starter she had kept alive since Ohio, and the house smelled extraordinary when he knocked. He stopped just inside the door and said, "That is a good smell." "Fresh bread," she said. "Come and sit." He sat in his chair and looked into the fire while she sliced the bread and set it on the table with butter she had churned from the goat milk that morning. He looked at the table and then looked at her with an expression she could only describe as grateful and not for the bread. She said, "I went to town this week." He said, "I know." He paused. Someone told you something." She looked at him sharply. "How do you know that?" he said quietly. "Because there are things people say about me, and it is a small town." She said, "Earl Pickett made a comment." Warren's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said, "What kind of comment?" She said, "The ignorant kind. The kind that says more about the man making it than the man it is made about." He looked at her. She could not entirely read his expression. She said, "I want you to know something, Warren. I do not care what Pickett says or what anyone else says. You have been nothing but good to me. Better than anyone has been to me since Thomas died, and honestly better than some people were before. Whatever anyone else thinks, that is what I know." He was very still. She thought he might not say anything at all. Then he said quietly, "It has not always been easy in this part of the country, being what I am." "I can imagine," she said softly. "No," he said, "not quite." He was not saying it harshly. He was just being precise. "You can hear about it. But the way a man looks at you when you walk into his store, or the way a table goes quiet when you sit down, that is something that happens in the body and you carry it there." He looked at the fire. "I am used to it, but I am used to it by being alone, away from it." She said very quietly, "Is that why you left the deer on the porch instead of knocking?" He was quiet for a long beat. He said, "Partly. And partly because I did not know what to say to a woman who had lost her husband." She said, "You could have said what you said the first time. You were alone and winter is long. That was enough." He looked at her. The fire cracked and shifted between them. He said, "You were not afraid when I came to the door. Most people are a little afraid of me on account of my size or on account of what I am. You opened the door like it was nothing." She considered this. She said, "I was watching you from the window every time you left a deer. You were always so careful. You never threw anything down or rushed. You always set things down gently. I thought, a man who handles things that gently is not a man I need to be afraid of." He looked at her for a long moment. She thought she saw something shift in his eyes, something deep and old moving toward the surface. He said, "Louisa." "Yes," she said. He said, "I want to say something and I want to say it right." She waited. Outside the snow kept falling, soft and steady. He said, "I have been alone a long time. Long enough that I stopped expecting anything else. I came to this property the first time because I passed through on the trap line and I saw the smoke was coming thin from the chimney and the woodpile was not right for a winter this bad. I did not plan anything beyond the first deer, but I found myself planning for the second, and then the third." She said, carefully, "Why?" He said, "Because I could not stop thinking about you, about a woman who stayed on this land alone and did not go back to wherever she came from, about someone that stubborn." She laughed. It came out surprised and genuine, and she covered her mouth and he looked startled for a moment and then he smiled. And it was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his whole face, opened it up like sun coming through cloud cover. She said, "That is a fine reason." He said, "It got to be more than stubbornness I was thinking about." She said, "I know the feeling." Another silence, but this one was a different quality of silence entirely. Full rather than empty. She said, "It is 2 days until Christmas, and I have bread and dried venison, and some preserved apples from a woman in town who was generous enough to part with a jar. If you have nothing waiting for you up the mountain, I would be glad to have the company." He looked at her with that steady, serious look. He said, "There is nothing waiting for me up the mountain." She nodded. "Then I will make up the settee in the sitting room," she said. She met his eyes firmly because she wanted to be clear and honest with him from the beginning. "It is not the most comfortable bed in the territory, but it is warmer than a cabin on Soldier's Peak in December." He nodded. He said, "I have slept in worse places than a settee." She said, "I imagine you have." Christmas Eve they sat up late by the fire. She had no decorations to speak of, only a small pine branch she had cut from the tree line and set in a jar on the mantel. He had gone out that afternoon and come back with a piece of wood he had been working on during his spare hours at the cabin, a small carved horse, the lines of it smooth and careful and unmistakably alive. He set it on the table between them without ceremony. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. She said, "Did you make this?" He said, I carve in the winter months. It occupies the hands. She said, it is beautiful. He said, I had in mind that it might suit you. She set the horse down on the mantel beside the pine branch and stepped back and looked at them. She said, there. Now it looks like Christmas. He came and stood beside her and looked at the mantel, and she could feel the warmth of him in the cold room, a solid and steady warmth. She said without turning her head, Warren, can I ask you something personal? He said, you can ask. She said, have you ever been in love with anyone? A long pause. He said, no, not in the way I believe you mean. There was a woman in my father's time, a woman at the trading post at Bent's Ford, but I was 17 and she was married, and it was more longing than love. He paused again. I am not sure I understood what it was supposed to feel like until recently. Until recently, she repeated. He turned his head and looked at her and said nothing, and she looked up at him and said nothing, and the fire was very warm, and the snow was still coming down outside, and the little carved horse stood on the mantel, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then she reached up and touched the side of his face, her palm against his bearded jaw, and he closed his eyes briefly in a way that broke her heart gently and put it back together at the same time. She said softly, it feels like this, I think. He turned his head and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist very gently, and she felt that all the way down to her heels. He said, yes, I think so. They did not kiss that night. They sat by the fire for another hour and talked about small things, quiet things, the kind of conversation that is actually about something much larger than what is being said. She talked about her mother's garden and the roses that came up every June, and whether she thought roses could grow at this altitude, and he said he had seen them grow higher, wild ones, in sheltered spots on the south-facing slopes, and that in the spring he could show her where if she wanted. She said she would like that very much. He slept on the settee, and she slept in her room and lay awake looking at the dark ceiling with his carved horse on the nightstand beside her lamp, where she had moved it without quite deciding to. On Christmas morning, she woke to find him already up and the fire stoked and coffee on the stove. He had gone out early and brought back a rabbit, which he was skinning in the kitchen with the clean efficiency of a man who did not waste motion. And when she came out in her heavy wool robe, he looked up and said, Merry Christmas, Louisa. And she stood in the doorway of her kitchen and thought that of all the things she had not expected this winter, this was the one she was most glad of. They spent the day quietly. She cooked and he kept the fire, and in the afternoon they walked out along the edge of the property in the deep snow, her breath coming in clouds, his hand occasionally at her elbow when the ground was uneven beneath the white. He pointed out signs she would never have read herself, a set of tracks crossing the field, the marks in the snow where an owl had struck a mouse, the way the elk had been moving south along the ridge. He spoke about the land with a knowledge that was not learned from books but from years of direct and sustained attention, and she listened with her whole self and thought that this was what it was to know something truly, to know it in the body rather than the head. She slipped on a buried stone and he caught her, one arm around her waist, and they stood tangled together in the snow for a moment, her hands on his chest, his arm firm and warm around her. She looked up at him from very close, and he looked down at her, and then very slowly, carefully, as though he was afraid of doing something irreversible, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, unhurried. She had not been kissed in 3 months, and before that, if she was honest, longer than that, because Thomas in his sickness had not had much capacity for tenderness. This kiss was warm and careful and tasted of cold air and coffee, and was entirely its own thing, not a comparison to anything that had come before. When they broke apart, he held her in the circle of his arm, and she pressed her forehead against his jaw, and they stood in the snow for a long moment without speaking. She said very quietly, I did not expect you. He said equally quietly, I did not expect you either. She said, is that all right? He said, it is the best thing I can think of. He left on the 27th to run the northern section of the trap line, which could not wait longer, and he would be gone for 10 days at minimum. He told her this at the door with his coat and hat on, and she listened and nodded practically. And then he pulled her in and held her for a long moment with her face against his chest and the solid warmth of him around her. And she put her arms around him and held on, and thought that 10 days would be a long time, and that she was not ashamed of thinking it. He said into her hair, "I will be back." She said, "I know." He said, "I meant to say, I have been leaving dear because I could not leave anything else. Because I did not know if I had anything else to offer, but I want to say it plainly. I think very highly of you, Louisa, more than I have thought of anyone." She looked up at him. She said, "Warren Garrison, you have kept me alive through the worst winter I have ever seen in my life, and you carved me a horse and you kissed me in the snow. I think that is quite a lot to offer." He looked at her with those warm, serious eyes. He said, "I intend to offer more if you will let me." She said, very softly, "I will let you." The 10 days he was gone were long and quiet. She had work to do, and she did it. The goats and the horse and the firewood and the cooking and the endless cold. But the house felt different in his absence, larger and more empty than it had before he started coming to it. She found herself talking to the carved horse on the nightstand, which she acknowledged was not entirely sane, and did not stop doing. She also spent some of those 10 days thinking seriously about what she was doing, and whether she was doing it for the right reasons. She did not want to love Warren Garrison because she was lonely. She did not want to love him because he had kept her fed through November and December. She tested the feeling against those possibilities, and it survived the testing, which told her something. She wanted to know him. She wanted to know the man who moved so carefully through the world and knew the mountain like a book, and listened when people spoke and made small carved horses in the quiet of a winter cabin. She wanted more of the conversations they had by the fire and more of the silences that felt full rather than empty. She wanted to hear more about the south-facing slopes where wild roses grew, and she wanted to tell him more about Ohio and her mother's garden, and whether there was such a thing as building a life worth calling that in the Colorado high country. Those were not the wants of a lonely woman. Those were the wants of a woman who had found something specific and was clear-eyed about it. He came back in 8 days rather than 10, which she noticed, and did not comment on except to look at him in a particular way when she opened the door, and he looked back at her in a particular way, and that was sufficient. January in the Colorado high country was a trial. The cold was a presence rather than a quality, something with personality and intention, pressing against the house at all hours and looking for ways in. Louisa burned through firewood faster than she had planned, and the water in the trough froze solid 3 consecutive nights, and the goats were thoroughly miserable and communicated this constantly. She was genuinely tired and sometimes frightened in the lonely hours before dawn when the wind sounded wrong and the temperature dropped past everything her thermometer could measure. But Warren came every few days. Sometimes he came for an afternoon, and sometimes he stayed the night on the settee, though there came a point in early January when they both acknowledged, without saying it directly, that the settee business was more about propriety than any other reason, and they held hands by the fire and she leaned against his shoulder, and thought that she had never known anyone like him. He told her more about his life in pieces, not in a flood but in careful portions, as though he was learning to trust that the ground would hold. He told her about his mother's people, about the particular music of the Ute language that he still carried in the back of his mind, even though there was no one left to speak it with him. He told her about his father, a rough and capable man who had loved his family in his practical way and died of a lung complaint before Warren was grown. He told her about a winter he had spent at 17 in a blizzard on the high plateau, completely alone, with no fire and dwindling supplies, and how he had survived it by doing the next necessary thing and then the next necessary thing and not looking past that. She said, "That sounds terrifying." He said, "It was. It was also when I understood that I could manage in this country, that it would not kill me if I was careful and did not panic." She said, "I think that is the bravest thing I have ever heard. Not the not panicking. That is a skill. The being alone with it and still managing." He looked at her with that steady, warm look. He said, "I am less interested in being alone than I was that winter." She said, "Good." He said, "I keep thinking about something." She said, "What?" He said, "Spring." "About what spring looks like here and whether you intend to stay and what that means." She looked at him carefully. She said, "I intend to stay. This is my land. Thomas filed for it and I am not giving it up." He nodded. He said, "And after spring?" She said, "What are you asking me, Warren?" He said, "I'm asking if you see a future here that includes more than just you and the goats and the horse." She said, "I see a future here that includes you if that is what you mean." He said, "That is what I mean." She said, "Then yes." He let out a slow breath like he had been holding it for longer than just this conversation. The end of January brought a problem that had nothing to do with the cold or the firewood or the food stores. A man named Dyson Crane, who ran a competing trap line out of the South Valley and had apparently had some kind of long-standing dispute with Warren over territory, rode up to Louis's property on a gray Tuesday and knocked on the door in the way that certain men knock, hard and without courtesy. She opened the door and looked at him. He was a lean and weathered man in his 40s with pale eyes and a particular quality of meanness that some men wore like they were proud of it. He said, "You are the Maddox widow." She said, "I am." "Can I help you?" He said, "I heard Garrison has been coming around here." She said, "That is not your concern." He said, "It is if he is using your property to run trap lines in my territory." She said, "Mr. Garrison comes here as a guest, and he is welcome here, and I am not aware of any arrangement between you two that is my business. If you have a dispute with him, I suggest you take it up with him directly." Crane's jaw tightened. He said, "You want to be careful who you let on your property, Mrs. Maddox. There are people in this valley who remember what Garrison is and where he comes from." She looked at him for a long, cool moment. She said, "Mr. Crane, I know exactly where Warren Garrison comes from and I know what he is. He is a good man and a generous one, and he is welcome on my property at any hour. If you have a problem with that, I am sorry for you, but I cannot help you. Good day." She closed the door. Her hands were shaking slightly when she went back to the kitchen, not from fear but from anger. A clean, cold anger at the casual cruelty of men like Crane who used a person's heritage like a weapon and thought themselves justified in it. She stood at the stove and breathed deliberately until the shaking stopped. She told Warren about it that evening, and he listened with a still face that she was beginning to understand held a great deal more than stillness. He said, "Crane and I have had disagreements about the trap line. He believes the high timber is his by right because he was there first. He does not acknowledge that I was there longer." She said, "He had no business coming here to talk to me about it. He said quietly he was hoping to unsettle you or to tell me something through you." She said, "He did not unsettle me." Warren looked at her. He said, "I know." She said, "Warren, I want you to be clear on something. I do not care about Crane or Pickett or anyone else who has something to say about you. I am telling you this not to be reassuring, but because it is simply true and I want you to know that it is true." He said, "I believe you." He paused. "I want to be clear about something too." She waited. He said, "I have never had anyone willing to close a door on a man like Crane on my account. I have never had anyone in my corner like that. I am not sure I know entirely what to do with it." She said softly, "You do not have to do anything with it. That is what being in someone's corner means." He reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he had reached for her hand instead of waiting for her to reach for his, and she thought it was probably one of the more significant moments of the whole winter. February came in gray and brutal. The cold deepened past anything Louisa had thought possible. She had been cold before, properly cold, but this was a different order of cold, the kind that got into the walls and the floor and the joints of her fingers and did not leave. The goat stopped giving much milk. The horse was deeply displeased and made his displeasure known. The woodpile, in spite of all efforts, was running lower than she liked. Warren spent more time at the house now. Not every night, but enough nights that it began to feel like an arrangement rather than a series of visits. He brought wood from the timber. He brought meat when the hunting was good. though hunting in February at this altitude was its own particular challenge. He did small repairs to the house that she had been putting off, the latch on the back door that had always been loose, the shutter on the north window that rattled in the wind, a section of the stable roof that had been worrying her since October. She watched him work and felt something she could only describe as rightness, the sense that this was how a thing was supposed to be, that this man in her kitchen, in her stable, at her fire, was not a temporary arrangement of circumstances but something fundamental. One night in the second week of February, when the storm had been going for 2 days and the world outside the windows was a solid white wall of moving snow, she brought him a cup of coffee where he sat reading the almanac she had brought from Ohio, and she sat beside him on the settee rather than across from him in the other chair. He lifted his arm without looking up from the almanac, and she settled against his side, and he put his arm around her and turned the page, and she thought, "This is what I came out to this territory for," even though she had not known it when she came. She said, "Warren," he said. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer is not going to change anything between us as far as I am concerned." He put the almanac down and looked at her. She said, "Have you thought about more than what we are now?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then he said, "I have thought about almost nothing else since Christmas." She said, and he said, "And I am aware of the things that make it complicated. I am aware that there will be people who have opinions about what I am and where I come from, and what that means for a widow woman trying to hold a homestead. I am aware that I have a cabin on a mountain and a trap line and not much else by most measures." She said, "By my measures you have a great deal." He said, "I know, but I want to be clear about what I am offering because I do not want you to think I have not thought about it clearly. I have thought about it very clearly." She said, "And what are you offering?" He looked at her. He said, "Everything I have, all of it. The trap line and the knowledge of this country, and whatever I can build on this land with you if you will have me." And he paused. He looked somewhat out of his depth, which she found enormously endearing. "A very great care for you that I do not have a more formal word for yet, though I expect I will arrive at it." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Warren Garrison, I believe the formal word you are looking for is love." He said quietly, "Yes, I believe it is." She said, "I believe I love you too." He turned and looked at her, and she could see in his face that this was not something he had let himself quite believe yet, and she watched him let himself believe it now, slowly, like sunrise. He said, "Louisa." She said, "Yes." He said, "Will you marry me?" It was not quite a question. It had a steadiness to it that made it more of a statement of intent, the way he said most important things, with all the weight of a man who had thought about something carefully and was now acting on it. She said, "Yes." Without any hesitation, she said yes. He held her then, both arms around her, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solidity of him and the warmth and the great quiet that surrounded him like its own climate. And she thought that she had married Thomas Maddox for love, and it had been good and real, and she did not diminish it. But this was something she could not have imagined when she was the girl in the dry goods store in Ohio, who had not yet learned what it meant to want someone all the way down to the bone. They rode down to Calhoun's Creek on the first clear day in the third week of February, and found Pastor Holly's at his church. Clara was there too, and she looked at their faces when they came through the door, and her own face broke into a smile that she made no effort to control. Pastor Holly's was a thoughtful man who had seen enough of the world to know that its contents were not always what convention expected, and he performed the ceremony in his church with Clara and his deacon as witnesses. And when it was done, he shook Warren's hand and said, "You are a good man, and I am glad for you both." Louisa signed the register as Louisa Garrison and felt the strangeness of a new name, and then felt it settle around her like something that had always fit. Clara hugged her and said in her ear, "I knew it," and Louisa laughed. They rode back up the mountain in the clear, cold afternoon, her horse and his horse side by side on the narrow road, and she said, "Well, here we are." He said, "Here we are." She said, "What are you thinking?" He said, I am thinking that I have lived on that mountain for a long time and I am still learning to expect good things. He looked at her. I am learning. She reached over from her horse and took his hand for a moment, their gloved hands clasped across the space between their horses. She said, so am I. March came with a shift in the light that was not yet warmth, but was the suggestion of warmth, a promise rather than a fact. The snow was still deep on the mountain, but the days grew longer, and the sun, when it came, had an angle to it that was different from January, and the goats seemed to notice and were slightly less miserable. The world, Louisa thought, was thinking about spring. Warren moved what he had from the cabin on Soldiers Peak down to the homestead. It was not much. His tools, his carving wood, his furs, his trapping equipment, his father's old rifle, a small collection of items that together did not fill more than 2 trips on horseback. But she made space for all of it, and he arranged his tools in the small shed off the stable with a care that made the shed feel inhabited in a way it had not before. Louisa watched him and thought about the life they were building, and felt something she had not felt since before Thomas got sick, which was the sense that the future was something to look forward to rather than something to survive. There were still difficulties. Pickett continued to be cold and occasionally openly hostile, muttering things in town that she ignored with the same pointed calm she had always used on him. Dyson Crane came through again in early March with another vague and aggressive statement about the trap line territory, and Warren handled it this time himself, going out to meet Crane on the road with a steadiness that Crane apparently found more unsettling than aggression, because the conversation ended quickly and Crane did not come back. The people in town were divided in the way that small towns are always divided, some of them warm and easy about it, like Clara and Cal Morrison, and some of them pointed in their coolness in a way that said things they were not willing to say out loud. Louisa did not pretend this was nothing. She talked to Warren about it honestly, asking him how he felt and actually wanting to know, and he said what he always said about it, that it was not new and he was not fragile on the subject, but that it was different now because it touched her and he did not like that. She said, I can manage it. He said, I know you can. I am not worried about whether you can manage it. I just do not like that you have to. She thought about this. She said, the world we live in is not always fair or kind, and there is not much we can do about the parts of it that we cannot change. But the parts we can change, the people who let us in, who are glad to know you, those are the parts worth holding on to. He said, I know. He looked at her. You have changed a great deal of what I thought was fixed. She said, good. The spring came slowly and then all at once, which is the way spring always comes in the mountains. The snow retreated up the slopes and the south-facing ridges turned green first and then the meadows and then the higher ground, and the creek that ran along the edge of the property came alive with snowmelt and ran clear and cold and fast. Warren was busy through April and May with the trap line, ending the winter season and assessing what he had, which was enough to provide a reasonable income for the year. Louisa planted the kitchen garden she had been planning since November, peas and beans and root vegetables and herbs, and she thought about roses, and asked Warren in early May about those wild ones he had mentioned on the south-facing slopes. He took her there on a Sunday, up through the timber where the trail wound above the property through the aspens that were just beginning to leaf out, small and trembling and an indescribable green. They climbed for perhaps an hour and came out on a long south-facing slope where the snow was gone and the ground was soft, and there, in a sheltered crook between 2 old gray rocks, was a rose bush, small and thorny and absolutely dormant but real. She crouched in front of it and put her fingers lightly on the stems. She said, can I take a cutting? He said, it is your mountain as much as anyone's. She looked up at him. He was standing above her with the sky behind him and the green aspens moving in the wind, and she thought she would remember this image for the rest of her life. She took a cutting, carefully wrapped in damp cloth, and carried it down the mountain. She planted it in a sheltered spot on the south side of the house and watered it and watched it, and it took root by June, putting out small tentative green shoots, and she felt absurdly triumphant. In the summer, Warren built on. He had the skills and the patience and an eye for what a house needed, and he added a proper second room that had been planned on paper since Thomas filed the claim but never built. He worked at it in the long evenings when the light lasted until 9 o'clock, and she worked beside him when she could, handing tools and holding boards and learning what he showed her without complaint. The neighbors who came past, the ones who were decent, stopped and admired the work. Clara Hollis came up in June with her husband, and they sat on the new porch in the long summer evening and drank the cold water from the well and talked about everything and nothing. And Louisa watched Warren talking with Pastor Hollis about the coming season's prospects and thought that he looked, for perhaps the first time in all the months she had known him, entirely at ease. Later, after the Hollises had gone back down the mountain road, she said, "You seemed comfortable tonight." He said, "I did." She said, "You did. It looked good on you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I have not had much practice at comfortable." She said, "I know, but you are getting better at it." He smiled, that smile that still changed his whole face, and put his arm around her in the dark, and she leaned into his side, and they sat on the new porch he had built and looked out at the mountain going dark above them and the first stars coming out over the ridge. He said quietly, "I want to tell you something." She said, "Tell me." He said, "When I was 17, alone in that blizzard on the high plateau, I told myself the only thing that mattered was getting through. I did not think past getting through. I think I was like that for a long time after, just getting through without asking for anything more." He paused. "You are the first thing I have asked for." She took his hand. She said, "I am glad you asked." He said, "I am going to keep asking things I want. I'm still learning how to do that." She said, "I will be here while you learn." By the end of the first summer together, the homestead looked different enough that Louisa could barely connect it to the half-finished, barely surviving thing she had come back to after Thomas died. The new room was done and furnished with plain, good furniture Warren had built himself. The kitchen garden was producing abundantly. The small stable had been expanded to accommodate the 2 horses properly. The rose cutting on the south wall had climbed 3 feet and put out its first flowers, pink and wild, and carrying a scent on the warm evening air that brought her mother's garden straight into her chest. In October, 2 days before the anniversary of the first deer on the porch, she told Warren she was expecting a child. She had been watching for his reaction with something between hope and anxiety, knowing that it was good news but not entirely sure how he held such news, given that he had spent most of his life in a world that had given him little reason to expect good things. She watched his face when she said it and saw something move through it that was larger than expression, a wave of something she recognized as joy because she felt it herself, a joy that was startling in its size. He said very quietly, "Louisa." She said, "Yes." He said, "Are you well?" She said, "Very well, more than well." He stood up from the chair and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I do not have the right words." She said, "You have the right face." He laughed, surprised, and then kissed her forehead and held her for a long time, and outside the window, the October aspens were going gold again, and the mountain was beginning to put on its first dusting of snow on the high peaks. And it was exactly 1 year since the first deer, and the world had become almost unrecognizably different. They told Clara and Pastor Hollis at Sunday services in November, and Clara's reaction was sufficiently enthusiastic that several heads turned in the small church. Warren accepted the congratulations with the quiet dignity that was his natural mode, and she saw him shake hands with Cal Morrison and with the deacon, and with 3 or 4 other men who had come around to knowing him as a person rather than a category, and she thought that the world changed slowly, but it changed. The second winter was different from the first in almost every way. It was still cold, still demanding, still a test of character and patience. But the root cellar was full, and the woodpile was enormous, and there were 2 people to keep the fire going and to hold off the dark. And there was something on the way that made all of it mean something it had not meant before. He did not leave deer on the porch that winter. He did not need to. He was inside with her where the note had asked him to come. They sat together in the evenings the way they had sat through the spring and summer, he with his carving and she with her mending or her reading, the fire warm between them and the wind outside doing its level worst and not reaching them. He was carving a cradle, working on it a little each evening, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen him make. The lines smooth and the joints tight and careful, each piece of it made with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. She watched him carve and thought about the first time she had seen him from the window, a dark figure in the pre-dawn gray setting a deer down with impossible gentleness on the porch of a widow he did not know. She thought about the note she had written and rewritten 3 times, and the days she had waited for an answer, and the 3 firm knocks on the door that had changed everything. She said, "Do you remember the first time you knocked?" He looked up from the cradle. He said, "I remember every time I have come to this door." She said, "What were you thinking when you knocked the first time?" "Honestly." He considered. He said, "I was thinking that you would probably send me away. That most people would if they did not know me. And I was thinking that it would be all right if you did, that I had managed before." She said, "And if I had," he said, "I would have kept leaving the deer." He paused. "I was not able to stop doing that regardless of anything else." She said, "Because winter is long." He said, "Yes, and because I could not stop thinking about you, even if you had sent me away, even if you had never opened the door." He met her eyes. "I would have kept coming back." She said, "Louisa," softly, "I would not have sent you away." He said, "I know that now." She said, "Did you know it then?" He said, "I hoped it." He smiled the smile. "You wrote that I was always welcome. I held on to that." She said, "I meant it when I wrote it." He said, "I know." She said, "I also mean this." He said, "What?" She said, "Whatever comes next. The child and the spring and the next winter and the years, all of it. I mean all of it with you." He set the carving down and came to her, and she put her hands on his chest, and he put his hands on her face, and they stayed like that for a long moment by the fire with the wind outside and the cradle on the table and the little carved horse on the mantel where it had been since Christmas of last year. He said, "I mean all of it with you." She said, "Good." He said, "Good." The boy arrived in May of 1880, in the good warm light of a spring afternoon when the meadow below the property was green and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the rose on the south wall was budding. Clara Hollis was there, and Warren was there, and the birth was hard but not terrible, and when it was done and Clara put the child in Louisa's arms, she lay back and looked at the red, squalling, furious small person, and felt something enormous and simple wash through her. Warren was beside her and she handed him the child without asking, just held it out, and he took the boy with both hands and held him with the same careful, steady attention he gave to everything. And the child looked up at him with unfocused dark eyes, and Warren looked down at him, and something on his face was so open and unguarded that she had to look away briefly because the sight of it was almost more than she could hold. He said, very quietly, "He is real." She said, "He is very real." He said, "What do you want to name him?" She had been thinking about this for weeks. She said, "I was thinking James. James Thomas Garrison. James for a start, Thomas for the man who brought me out here, and Garrison for the man who kept me here." He looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way she had not quite seen in them before, a brightness that had nothing to do with keeping things back. He said, "James Thomas Garrison. That is a name worth having." She said, "I think so." James Thomas Garrison grew up on the homestead at the edge of the Colorado high country, and he grew up tall and dark-eyed like his father and stubborn, and opinionated like his mother. And this combination made him a force of nature in miniature that kept both of them fully occupied. He learned to walk in the kitchen, and immediately walked himself directly out into the yard, and had to be retrieved from the garden. And Warren watched this with a look that was equal parts alarm and pride, and Louisa laughed until her sides hurt. He learned the mountain early, the way his father had, going out with Warren on the easier trails when he was old enough to manage them, learning to read the signs that Warren could read, learning the names for things that Warren knew from his mother's language and from his own long knowledge. Louisa watched them together on those mornings when they came back from the trails, the boy chattering and Warren listening and occasionally saying a word or two that made the boy's face light up. And she thought about what it meant to give a child two worlds instead of one, to say here is everything. Take all of it. None of it cancels the rest. In the spring of 1882, 2 years after James was born, she told Warren she was expecting again. This time he held her immediately and said, without any hesitation at all, "Good. This is good." And she laughed because she had been so afraid he would be frightened, and instead he was simply glad, and simple gladness was, she thought, one of the things she loved most about him, the way he had learned, slowly and carefully, to simply be glad. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1882, and they named her Clara Rose. Clara for the woman who had been there at both births and at the wedding and at every significant moment between, and Rose for the wild roses on the south-facing slope and the cutting on the south wall that had climbed now to the eaves and bloomed every summer in pink abundance. Clara Rose came into the world already decided about herself. She had her father's steadiness and her mother's sharpness, and she was, from her first clear-eyed look at the world, entirely unconvinced that anyone knew better than she did about anything. Warren held her the first time and looked at her with his whole face open and said, "She is going to be trouble," and Louisa said, "She is going to be wonderful," and they were both right. Earl Pickett sold his land and moved south in the spring of 1883, tired of the altitude or tired of losing arguments with the world, and the family that bought his land were young and decent, and the wife came to introduce herself in April and shook Warren's hand with a straightforward friendliness that made Louisa feel the world turning, very slowly, in a better direction. Dyson Crane continued to be Dyson Crane, but with Warren established on the land and the homestead visibly prospering, his territorial complaints had less weight behind them and less audience willing to indulge them. By 1884, he had largely stopped coming by at all. Cal Morrison retired from the general store and passed it to his nephew, who was 23 and eager, and had been hired by Cal specifically, because he treated every customer with the same straightforward courtesy, which was the way Cal said a store ought to be run, and which the nephew had apparently taken entirely to heart. Calhoun's Creek grew slowly, the way mountain towns grew, adding a proper schoolhouse in 1884 that Louisa had been a consistent advocate for in every town meeting she attended, which was all of them. The teacher who came was a small, serious woman of 30 named Miss Adkins, and James Garrison was in her first class and distinguished himself primarily by already being able to read at a level that made Miss Adkins look sharply at his parents and say, "He has had excellent teaching at home." Louisa looked at Warren, and Warren looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who was not going to take credit, but also was not going to deny it. The homestead by 1885 was a proper ranch by the standards of the high country. The house had been added to twice more, with a proper sitting room and a room for each child, and the stable had grown to house 4 horses, and the land had been broken and planted and fenced, and it bore the marks of years of patient, intelligent work. There was a kitchen garden that Louisa's mother would have envied, and a modest orchard of apple trees that Warren had planted on the east slope and which had, against the odds and with considerable encouragement, survived 3 brutal winters and were beginning to produce in earnest. The rose on the south wall was the tallest wild rose either of them had ever seen, climbing now to the peak of the roof line, and it bloomed every summer and filled the entire south side of the house with a scent that drifted through the open windows of the bedroom, where Warren lay awake on warm nights and Louisa read her almanac and James, and Clara Rose slept deeply in their separate rooms, and the mountain was dark and vast and endlessly itself above them. One evening in the summer of 1885, with James 5 years old and Clara Rose 2 1/2 and both of them put to bed in the long summer dark, Warren and Louisa sat on the porch in the chairs he had made and looked at the mountain and the sky. The evening was very still. The last of the light was going from the western ridge, a slow fade from gold to rose to deep blue, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern peaks. She said, "Warren." He said. She said, "Do you think you are happy?" He looked at her. This was a different kind of look from the early days, more open, familiar with itself, the look of a man who had learned to trust the ground beneath him. He said, "I know I am happy. I'm not guessing about it." She said, "I am too. I wanted you to know I am aware of it. Sometimes I think we go through our good days without stopping to say, 'This is a good day, I know it right now.'" He said, "This is a good day." She said, "It is." He said, "And they all have been, even the hard ones." She thought about the first winter, the cold and the loneliness and the fear and the deer on the porch that had changed everything. She thought about the note she had written by the lamp in the deep cold, the careful sentences and the scratched-out lines, and the final simple invitation. She thought about 3 knocks on the door, and a man with a hat in his hand saying Miss Maddox, and the way she had said just "Louisa will do," and how that had been the beginning of everything. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. He turned his hand over and held hers, their fingers laced together in the way they had learned over the years, the fit of it so familiar now that it was like breathing. He said, quietly, "I left that first deer because I could not think of anything else to do. I did not have words for it then. I just knew that I could not keep walking past this place like it had nothing to do with me." She said, "It had everything to do with you even then." He said, "I know that now." She said, "I knew it when I wrote the note. I did not know what it would become, but I knew it was the right thing to say. Come inside, because that is what I wanted. I just wanted to say it clearly." He looked at her with those warm, serious eyes in the last of the summer light, and she looked back at him, and everything that had happened between the note and this moment was there between them, visible and real. 2 full years of hard winter and good work and difficult mornings and beautiful evenings, and 2 children asleep inside the house they had made together. And beyond that, the mountain going dark above the tree line, and the stars coming out one by one over the ridge. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, the same quiet gesture he had made that first winter by the fire, and she felt it the same way she had felt it then, all the way through. She said very softly, "I love you, Warren Garrison." He said, "Louisa." He held her hand against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady and sure. "I love you. All of it, all the time. There has not been a day since you wrote that note that I have not known exactly what I have." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the stars coming out over the Colorado mountains. And the night came down warm and full of crickets and the sound of the creek below the property. And James and Clara Rose slept in their rooms, and the carved horse stood on the mantel inside, and the wild rose breathed on the south wall of the house that was theirs, and the mountain held them all in its vast and patient dark. And this was the life she had stayed for. The life she had asked for in a note tied to the burlap wrapping of a deer on a cold November morning. And it was, she thought with a completeness she had not known she was capable of, everything.